Okay, so good morning, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Awaaz In Focus, an initiative of Azad Awaaz. This monthly patrika focuses on marginalized sections of societies whose voices are often muted in the cacophony of flashy mainstream media discourse. When talking about marginalization, this platform does not aim to only focus on caste and race alone, but also aspires to include discussions on gender, class identity, environmentalism, and more. In this edition of Azad Awaz, we are unpacking the politics of demolitions. We examine how demolitions serve as electoral strategies, projecting authority and consolidating votes under the guise of governance, often cloaked in the rhetoric of law and order. The theme extends to the erasure of cultural identities, where targeted demolitions of religious and historical sites act as instruments of symbolic violence, perpetuating systemic marginalization. Amid this devastation, resistance emerges as a powerful counter narrative. From grassroots protests to courtroom victories, communities are fighting back, reclaiming their spaces and dignity. Yet, for many, the aftermath of demolition is a prolonged struggle. Displaced families face fractured livelihoods and inadequate rehabilitation. Through compelling analysis, on ground stories, and case studies, this issue sheds light on the enduring scars left by demolition politics while amplifying voices of resilience and resistance. Together, we emphasize on the urgent need for accountability, solidarity, and systemic change, envisioning a future where justice prevails over rubble. For this episode of Awaaz in Focus, we are thrilled to welcome Professor Ambreen Agha to a discussion. Dr. Agha serves as an associate professor at the Jindal School of International Affairs. Dr. Ambreen Agha is a scholar with varied research interests in the field of comparative studies on Muslim societies, identity politics, gender, and religion. In her research, she is exploring and understanding the role of women in religious revivalist movements and how gender is mobilized in nationalist politics. She received her PhD from Center for Political Studies, Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi, and holds master's degree in CPS from JNU itself. Her research and book essays have appeared in EPW, Contemporary South Asia, India Quarterly, and others. She writes columns on politics and religion in national and international media, The Indian Express, The Hindu, Wire, Outlook, TRT World, and Himal South Asian, among others. Recently, her piece on bulldozer justice was published by the global magazine Foreign Policy. Prior to joining Jindal, Dr. Agha was research fellow at Indian Council of World Affairs, New Delhi. Before that, she worked as research associate at Institute for Conflict Management, New Delhi, where her area of research was political violence and religious extremism in Pakistan. Thank you so much, Professor, for sparing time for us today and joining today for this conversation. I think let's just dive deep. Let's just directly dive into the questions. So my
Yeah,
first
sure.
question
Thank
to
you. Yeah.
Okay.
Thanks,
So my
Ananya.
first
Yeah.
question to you is, so bulldozer justice, which refers to the act of demolition by the state machinery without due process of law on the ground that they were accused of criminal offences, has been a prominent phenomena in various states, including Uttar Pradesh, Madhya Pradesh, Gujarat, etc. How do such mass demolitions carried out under bulldozer justice challenge constitutional protections such as due process, right to property, which is Article 300A, and the right to equality, Article 14? The second question is, what gaps in existing laws allow authorities to bypass these protections?
Yeah. Okay. So, Ananya, I'll start by first saying that we can look at this entire thing as what Giorgio Agamben has theorized, state of exception. By this I mean to say that governments seize extraordinary powers, suspending laws. And these are basically moments when normal legal frameworks are set aside. And bulldozer justice or demolitions is basically extra legal demolition of homes, businesses, of places of worship, of particular community, largely targeting Muslims in India. And this practice by the state bypasses legal procedures, violating due process and property rights, as you mentioned in your question. And while this is one way of looking at it, there's also what I want to say is that there are times when governments weaponize existing laws against a particular group, targeting a particular group. And in such cases, law in itself may not always be the answer to address the excesses of the state. And for instance, there are many instances, if you look at the history of Indian politics, where draconian laws have been introduced not only to punish specific communities, but also with the whole purpose of reinforcing state authority. That state is uh, the I mean, state is the primary thing, in the sense you cannot violate its existence, sovereignty, or question or dissent. It's not something new that we see. And so law is not always a panacea. That's what I want to bring your attention to. Like, we look for refuge in law, of course, that is in some cases, but that's not the only source of panacea. And anyway, on this particular question that you asked, issue, which is bulldozer justice, yes, I agree. We do have constitutional protections, like due process, right to property, right to equality. But in this particular instance, we've seen how this has been blatantly overlooked. And I'm being mild when I say overlooked. In fact, it has been consciously violated, if I were to be honest. This and we need to basically remember that laws are created and executed not in a vacuum. All of this is not happening in a vacuum. There is a larger political context in which laws are executed, in which laws are created. And what we are witnessing today is, of course, not the rise, but rather consolidation of Hindutva politics. So we have to look at this whole process in the larger politics of Hindu nationalism and the consolidation of that idea. And this is where we see that laws on illegal encroachment, whether it's urban planning, municipal regulations that exist for the purpose of maintaining civic order, are increasingly being misused, and that too selectively. So what they say, rather, in dispensing justice, which is termed as bulldozer justice. So it has disproportionately targeted Muslim homes, businesses, as I said, places of worship. And in almost all cases, demolitions have been conducted without prior notice and with no opportunity for appeal, which also violates this principle of natural law and natural justice, sorry. And moreover, there is no uniformity in the application of law, which basically talks about state bias towards a particular group. And so you basically overlook similar violations by other groups while targeting a minority group. And so, for instance, there have been cases of demolition of homes of Muslim protesters on the pretext of illegal structures, even though those structures have existed for years or even for decades. So just because you participated in a particular protest or dissenting, your homes are targeted. And there's another example that I want to give from Uttar Pradesh. Uttar Pradesh being a state where bulldozer justice actually first became gained prominence. And I think so. The maximum number of cases of demolitions have happened in Uttar Pradesh, and mm, and the homes of these alleged rioters were demolished as a form of punishment. The idea was of inflicting collective punishment, rather. And despite the fact that there were no criminal convictions that had taken place against those quote unquote offenders. So this action by the state violated the principle of innocent until proven guilty. Hmm? And mostly in BJP ruled states, though I'll say that it also has extended to other states which are Congress ruled. For instance, I think so there's a case in Karnataka of demolition. So, but primarily this has happened in BJP ruled states, where bulldozer demolitions have been used as extrajudicial punishment under the guise of cracking down on criminal elements. And this has disproportionately affected one particular religious group, which is Muslims. Also, there are cases of Dalits' home being demolished, and a few Christian, but largely Muslims. And however, the Supreme Court in its judgment noted that criminal punishment must come through judicial process and not through executive demolition orders. And as far as the gaps that you're talking about in existing laws are concerned, I think we can look at the issue of oversight, judicial oversight. in most cases. So what we see is that courts intervene post facto, but the damage that has been done is irreversible. And this tells us that we need stronger preemptive legal safeguards, something that can prevent this. Something like very unique happened, interesting happened yesterday. For instance, the Supreme Court yesterday lambasted the UP government for demolishing the house of five people, a lawyer, a professor, and three other people in Allahabad, Prayagraj. And so the Supreme Court invoked Article 21 and the right to shelter. And in invoking this, Justice Oak and Justice Koteshwar Singh, they basically called the demolitions shocking and wrong, and said that what was very interesting is that they basically said that this is something that needs to be corrected. And how are they basically looking at correction? They basically said that they ordered the state to reconstruct the demolition properties at the state's expense. Now, this is something I think so, which is welcome. This idea, that the state's authorities have done this, so it's going to be reconstructed at the expense of the state. And so I'm telling you this because I want to bring your attention to the point that more than laws, I believe we need judges who stand firm and unwavering even in front of the most authoritative governments, who is being entrusted with in these institutions is something which is very important and integral to the idea of preservation of democracy, of equality, of justice. So who is being entrusted? That's a question which is very important. And yeah, that's what I would like to say. Thank you.
Yeah, it's really I think it will be a precedental judgment if
Mm,
this is implied in practice also. And when Supreme Court or other state courts realize like what is being done in the ground, it really sets the tone right for the state bureaucrats or even street level bureaucrats to,
mm,
undo the things that they have been doing. Apart from this, I think this sets the tone for the next question, which is in addition to the weaponization of bulldozer that we are talking about, the nation is also witnessing increased pleas being filed in the Supreme Court revolving around surveys to ascertain the original religious character of mosques, particularly
mm,
mosques. We are currently witnessing what is happening in Sambhal, for example, where it witnessed violence on 24th November 2024, the second day of the Shahi Jama Masjid survey, after a local court ordered it. Protesters gathered near the mosque and clashed with local police, leading to heavy stone pelting and alleged gunshots being fired by cops. The UP police, in its defense, has claimed that it used mild force again to control the situation. Five people died and several others were injured in the clashes. UP police denied charges that it fired at the protesters. How do you think such practices impact the social fabric of the nation?
mm,
Diversity is something that India has boasted about from
mm.
centuries, that we are a
Yeah,
diverse nation. But when we hear
yeah,
something like this, how does it reflect on our whole image as a diverse nation, and how does it
yeah.
impact the unity on ground?
Yeah, I think so. It has really profound implications on our society, whether it is bulldozer demolitions or it's continuous surveys of religious sites, and also what's happened in Sambal. I think I'll give you an example here. Like when I started the interview, I talked about this idea of the state of exception.
Yeah.
But now I think so, I believe we have reached a point where it is no longer an exception, but a norm. Hmm? And especially when we talk of the social fabric or the society or intercommunal communal relationships, So there's this instance of demolition in Delhi. I think the Tughlaqabad area, if I'm not wrong, and which was basically the largest clearance drive in the city.
Yeah.
And if you look at the response of the residents of the area, it's quite disturbing. So there's a woman who has been a voter of the BJP forever, as long as she can remember, and she basically came out to say that. that we are not Rohingyas or we are not Muslims. And why is basically the government targeting us? If the government has issues with Muslims, then don't trouble us. And if they want to remove Muslim homes, then please go ahead and do that. We are Hindus. So the government needs to spare us. And this particular statement actually tells us how deep is the normalization of demolition of Muslim homes, or rather, how acceptable it has become in the society, to basically see the demolition of your very neighbors who you've been living with forever. The idea of diversity, fine, there's diversity, but how have we cultivated that? It's so easy to basically um, ruin it, in the sense a change of government can ruin it. Then I think that we need to look beyond the larger discourse of just diversity. And I'll say that the government has been rather very successful in fostering hatred among communities, especially this particular government. Of course, there were previous governments also, when we had communal clashes. It's not like for the first time that we see all of this, but yeah, the magnitude is at a different level. So yes, we see I think so, erosion of communal harmony, right? And politicization of religious identities in India is at its peak. So if there are frequent legal and administrative actions centered around religious sites, it basically runs the risk of turning religious identity into a tool of political mobilization. So that's what we've been reduced to. Religious identities have been reduced to. And so, of course, these attempts are largely made to create divisions, and primarily with an aim for electoral gains, as you were mentioning in your
Yeah.
introduction. All of this is done for electoral victories. And but what is more concerning, I believe, um, is the rise of mistrust that people have in institutions today. Huh?
Yeah.
So when law enforcement agencies are accused of using excessive force, or when courts order controversial surveys, I believe public faith in these institutions diminishes, or rather, I think so, it withers away. And there's a complete lack of transparency. So this lack of transparency, or perceived bias in governance, further fuels resentment. And of course, there are then chances of unrest happening. So there is mistrust, deepening of mistrust, and also normalization of violence in public discourse. So often we see something is happening on the streets. Like I think so a few days ago we saw a few men on the Akbar road. They were, I think so, throwing water, peeing on it, something, just to
Yeah.
deface the thing. That. So it's become so normalized that that then there are repeated incidents of violence or communal clashes, and this has basically, the idea has been normalized. So there's something called mob mentality, which has developed, and this is a making of the present government. That you've normalized a first hate, and then the thing that you can basically go hit, do anything on the streets with impunity. I don't know if these people are ever caught, you know. And yeah, that's all that I wanted to talk about on this question. Yeah.
Yeah, so the next, I'll just go to the next question, which is the concept of illegal demolitions. It violates the very basic principle of rule of law. The Supreme Court, in its verdict last November, in context of several petitions that the court was hearing from the beginning of September 2024 by a division benches of Justice Gawai and KV Vishwanathan against bulldozer demolition, substantively condemned the use of such illegal practices, invoking extraordinary powers under Article 42 of the Constitution to issue a slew of binding directives to fasten accountability on public officials. So, as we were talking about how this develops into a mistrust regarding the institutions that are responsible for implementation of such policies. So, what has been the on-ground impact of the government and the bureaucracy? And do you think that there is a
And
significant change that we are witnessing?
mm, Okay, so I think that of course, the Supreme Court, I think that was a very important verdict that came out, and I think so it was a little bit of respite, as to what was happening. They condemned illegal demolitions, they called it unacceptable. They established guidelines, and the guidelines were basically to ensure due process, including mandatory 15-day prior show cause notices, videography of demolition proceedings, and I think so something very important which was there was compensation for families who were affected, and also action against the officials who were or accountability for officials, right? And so municipal bodies have been directed to create digital platforms within 3 months of the verdict. To the idea behind this is to basically publicly document demolition orders, show cause notices, and also anything that's related to this particular act of demolition. So my point is that it's for an open society, transparency is very important. If we are an open society, then public should have knowledge of what's happening. So that's basically, I think that that's the idea behind this verdict. And but I think that we are still to see if and when these guidelines are implemented. I'm not sure if they have been implemented so soon. And also on the question of change, I'm not very hopeful with Uttar Pradesh, because I say this because I think so in February, the beginning of February, there's a mosque, Madani Mosque, which is a few kilometers away from the capital city, which is Lucknow. Yeah, the mosque is in Kushinagar, and this mosque was demolished on the grounds of encroachment. Um, and what's interesting here is that the action was taken after a resident of the area, his name was Ram Bachchan Singh. He had basically complained on the chief minister's portal that the Madani Masjid was built after encroaching the government land. So you see how citizens have been turned into vigilantes working for the government. And so I don't see a dramatic change on ground as such. I don't see a change in social attitudes, and also I don't see a change in government bias in such cases. So despite that we have the verdict, the government authorities went on to demolish on February 2025. So I don't know how are the guidelines being followed, the guidelines that were given, and what is the response then, what happens. It's been, I think so, a month now, close to a month, so I don't know what happened on that particular demolition. So change, I am not sure. Hmm?
So this was in
Yeah,
February.
February, yeah,
This
early February, yeah, I remember. Yeah.
Okay, okay.
Mm,
Yeah, so also Amnesty International in its detailed report on bulldozer justice interviewed several victims and eyewitnesses who were found mentioning about the role of RAF or the Rapid Action Force,
mm,
who was deployed heavily, and civil officers which are being heavily deployed during demolition drives, but not on days when the violence actually breaks out. Do you think
mm,
such tactics of intimidation creates an atmosphere of fear between the community, and then it ultimately also impacts how the minorities view the such government institutions? How this
mm,
impacts the accessibility of the minorities
mm,
and the
mm.
willingness to access such institutions.
Hmm. Yeah, yeah, of course. Such tactics contribute to an atmosphere of fear, distrust between communities, distrust between minority and the state also. So there is the selective deployment of security forces, which is when you ensure a heavy presence during demolition drives and the complete absence when violence erupts. This basically raises concerns about institutional bias and tactic of intimidation. And in fact, police at times is seen to be colluding with the rioters from the majority community, and I'm talking about this rather referring to the Delhi riots of February 2020. When police were accused of attacking residents of the riot affected area. They were accused of shooting people randomly. And I remember there was a video that was widely circulated on social media later in February that year. And it showed that a group of men were being beaten up by the police as they lay on the ground injured. And what was the police doing? Police was actually forcing them to sing the national anthem. you know. So I'm not sure if any of them have been arrested till now. So you see, either there is collusion by the police or there's complete inaction by the police in such cases, huh? And there are deep effects of such tactics on the society as a whole, in terms of, as I just said, there is fear, there's psychological distress, there's a sense of helplessness, there's a sense of you being persecuted or targeted, and which can have a long term psychological trauma or insecurity. Then there is, as I said before, erosion of trust in law enforcement, and which can be counterproductive, because if people do not trust law enforcement, it would make law enforcement less effective, for many other things. And then, of course, there's heightened communal tensions, there's like resentment, there's social division among communities. And more than that, I think so, there's something which has happened in our country, and it is self censorship, you know and I think so, that there is deterrence from exercising any kind of democratic right, and also which leads to self censorship. And if people fear retaliation, if people fear punitive action by the state, something like demolitions for protesting, for expressing dissent, they will of course end up censoring themselves, and this is a victory of state imposed censorship. So yes, state has imposed censorship for the last decade or more, and now people have started to censor themselves. So there is a larger fear which grips the society, where you can look at any space. Now people would like to whisper about the government, I mean, if they are critical about the government or anything, rather than talk loudly and comfortably. That space has not shrunk, it's vanished. So I think so their fear is something which is very deep, now.
So, when we talk about such instances of the minority culture and identities being subverted by the this majoritarian state, so since your work is also on gender and religion and how violence also shapes gender, so do we see differential impact of such instances on men and women, or are are the burdens being shared mutually by both sexes?
I believe, of course, I think so. We also have to look at, when we look at violence of the state, most of the men languish behind the bars, are incarcerated without trial. So, the state, while of course, for I think so, when we look at Muslim women, I see that the state somehow uh, pretends to be a messiah of the oppressed Muslim women,
Especially
so there
after
is a
the whole triple
duality.
talaq. Yeah.
Yeah, triple talaq, and so I think so. Men bear violence in this term, in this particular situation, But when there's something like riots, so women are the first victims, in the sense where rape as a tool is used, in riots. So I think so. There are different kinds of violence inflicted on men and women, and men have this burden, in the sense, in terms of, because they are the ones on the streets, and they end up being behind bars. So I think so. I would not like to compare who is more, in the sense, faces more violence, but I think so there is violence both men and women face in such situations, and
Yeah.
yeah, and the data suggests that the incarceration is more of the men behind
Hmm.
bars without any trial, from the Muslim community. So
Hmm.
I
So
think
even when
so.
we
Yeah,
so when we say that the incarceration is more on men, so obviously the men is behind bars, but there's a mental trauma that is attached with the women as well,
yeah.
because
Of
she's
course,
the one
the
who's
absence
left
of the
behind.
man. Yeah,
Yeah.
of course. So that's why it's very
So
difficult to compare whose thing is more,
yeah.
in the sense, I think so it's different. The state is treating both differently. At
Hmm.
one point you're coming and saying, "Oh, Muslim women are oppressed." For instance, the hijab controversy, also for that matter. So
Yeah.
basically you want to liberate them. So I think so. The state pretends to be a liberator of the
Hmm.
oppressed women, while they are not looking at how they are. Um, Attacking or targeting men of the community. So yeah, that's sort of the same.
So this brings me to my last question, which is
Hmm.
how does the media's framing of bulldozer demolitions shaping public opinion? Does mainstream coverage focus more on justifying the state's actions or really highlighting how rights are being violated on ground? How do alternative media platforms such as social media and independent journalism, like there are a few which comes to mind, so for example, Ravish Kumar or Rana Ayub for that matter, challenge
Hmm.
mainstream narratives? And
Hmm.
what legislative and judicial reforms do you think are necessary to address the issues that we talked about at length?
Okay. So I think so. Yes, the mainstream media's coverage is absent, or rather, it's distorted. On the issue of bulldozer demolitions, justice, and this has had an impact on the larger public perception on such policies. And not only that, it also shapes narratives around ideas of legality, on ideas of justice and human rights. So we have seen how the mainstream media coverage was actually largely polarized. So I think so they
Yeah,
foment polarization, the mainstream media. And they end up justifying the narratives of the state. The point is the media is to question the state and the government. That's the purpose. But here, what do we see? That the mainstream media actually indulges in the justification of the narratives given by the state. So many mainstream outlets frame bulldozer or had framed bulldozer demolitions as a law and order issue, measure. They emphasized government's claim that they target illegal encroachments, they target rioters, criminal elements. So this is a state's narrative. The media should be questioning that, but mainstream media rather reinforces this narrative. And of course, then they use very sensationalist headlines, and these headlines are given with the sole purpose of reinforcing the state's position, and portraying demolitions as a crackdown on crime rather than violation of due process. While that is there, there's another approach to it, which was there in your question, as far which is human rights perspective. As far as human rights perspective is concerned, so there are media houses which I will say are independent journalists, or international media houses. They have so far highlighted the arbitrary and the extrajudicial nature of demolitions. And they are the ones who highlighted how lack of due process, how selective targeting of minorities, how the humanitarian consequences of these demolitions, which is basically homelessness, uh, and they are the ones who reported on this. And you talked about Amnesty International. Apart from Amnesty International, there are independent investigative journalists, who've worked or who focus on bringing out the voices of the victims. And when they bring out the voices of the victims, what are they doing? They're basically challenging the narrative of the state or the narrative of the mainstream media. And this is where I think so the role of alternative media or social media is very important in giving a counter narratives through the grassroots reporting. So they are there on the ground, they're meeting victims, and they bring out ground reports, they interview the affected communities, families, that mainstream channels deliberately do not cover. you know so
yeah.
we have platforms like the YouTube, Twitter, Instagram. These are all amplifying dissenting voices, and they expose instances of alleged bias of the state or injustices of the state. So there's something called, I don't know if you've heard of, citizen journalism.
Yeah,
So
like
citizen journalism, so on ground footage, people would take out their mobile phones, they will live stream, and I mean, most of the times it's basically to challenge the official claims, you know, giving an unfiltered perspective on demolitions and the impact. So you've seen viral videos of police excesses, of abrupt demolitions, and they often pressure authorities then to respond. So I think so. Apart from that, we also have something called fact checking, because there we live in a world of disinformation, misinformation. So it's so difficult to distinguish between truth and, in the sense, false news. So I think so. There are fact checking platforms and outlets that debunk narratives that are basically backed by state, or maybe that are peddled by partisan media, mainstream media. So yes, I think so. They play a very important role. And as far as your last question is concerned, on what laws,
You're
right? What
not
was the
audible,
question?
Professor. Oh, sorry.
Okay, so as far as your last question is concerned, you were talking about law. What laws can be
Yeah,
introduced to
reforms,
address
judicial and legislative
reforms?
reforms.
Yeah, so I think so. There are things like at least in this case of demolitions, we can think of pre-approvals, judicial pre-approvals for demolition. So basically how courts should intervene. They should, it's not like they come after the demolition has taken place, so the idea that courts should authorize to prevent any kind of arbitrary action by the government authorities, and I mean penalty for illegal demolitions. And I think that the courts should come really harsh on this if there is
Yeah.
any kind of arbitrary excesses by the state. I mean, for instance, uh, imposing fines, suspension, legal action. There have to be strict laws that ensure that no demolition occurs, especially during criminal proceedings, because they are done on the pretext of criminal activity. And the whole idea is to prevent punitive the idea of punitive justice or the idea of punitive demolitions. And also, I was thinking if there can be something like a legal commission and or an independent ombudsman, and they should basically investigate complaints of discrimination in demolition orders. So there have to be more checks. In all, I mean, um, the idea is to do justice, and
Yeah.
rather than injustice in the name of justice. And also, I think the important point is now there's so much damage done to, I think so, families run in thousands, who've lost their homes. So I think so very important point is about rehabilitation. What do we have on rehabilitation, on compensation policies, so I think so that's something which is very important, because the damage is done. So the Supreme Court has come out with guidelines, UP being notorious and not listening to that. But I think so we have to revisit these things, and see that how are we compensating for the damages that the people have experienced. So I think so that's where we lack, and that's where we can bring reforms. Yeah.
Yeah, I think surely what the judiciary and how the judiciary moves ahead with this is surely something we need to look at. And right now we are not, particularly we do not want what we can do after the damage is done, but rather something
Mm,
that we need to focus to undo the whole situation as such, because the damage on ground has been tremendous. Uh,
mm,
Communities are being uprooted, families are being moved out and forced to move out of their places of birth and where they
mm,
work and everything. So this is
mm,
basically this is a topic which is very close to how a society was envisioned and how it has become today. So
mm,
yeah, I think what will unfold in the future does depend to a whole lot on how our policies and laws are framed in the future. Thank
mm,
you so much, Professor. On that note, I want to thank you for sparing time for us and sharing your insights on this topic, which is often talked about but not really discussed at length. We
mm.
deeply respect your insights on this, and I think it will lead to more meaningful discussions on the topic. Thank you once
Yeah.
again for joining us today.
Thank you, Ananya, for calling me. Yeah. Thanks a
It
lot.
was a
Yeah.
pleasure to have you on board.
Likewise. Yeah. Bye bye.
Okay.
Should I leave?